the first session is a keynote session. The keynote topic, as you can see in here, is the course of the COVID-19, the pandemic in our society. And the first keynote session will be delivered by Professor Nicolas Christakis. And he is a professor at Yale University, and he directs the Human Nature Laboratory and the Yale Institute of Network Science, with his research on the focus on the network science, biosocial science, and behavior genetics. Dr. Christakis has a very unique combination of educational background in medicine and public health and sociology. And among many areas, he has been working on the societal impact of health issues like the current pandemic. I guess many of us have read his book. He's an author of a best-selling book, Apollo's Arrow, 신의 화살, which has been translated into Korean last summer as well. Before I ask Dr. Christakis for his lecture, I would like to inform the audience that Christakis will talk without slides, which is not very familiar with a Korean audience, but he mentioned that he will use very slow English so that everybody can follow. So he will have some time to ask questions after the lecture. So if you have any question, you are very much welcome to ask a question. So now, Nicolas, would you go ahead, please?
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Dean Zhang, Dean Han, Dean Che, and Professor Che for having me. Usually I do use slides when I speak, especially when I speak about networks, which are very visual. But I have found that using on Zoom, the slides are very distracting, at least when I speak in English to, in American audiences. And so I've gone to just speaking directly like this to the camera. So let me just talk for a little bit about what we can know about the course of pandemics from studying the history of respiratory pandemics and actually of plagues going back thousands of years, and tell you a little bit about what I think and what many others think is the likely course of this pandemic. So all of us happen to be alive during a once-in-a-century event. Something very unusual is happening to us as a species. A new pathogen is being introduced into our midst, and it will be with us forever. It is going to become endemic. And from the point of view of the pathogen and evolutionary biology, this pathogen is having what is known as an ecological release. It's like an invasive species to us. Like if we went to an isolated island on the Pacific and released rats accidentally on that island, and the rats overran the island, they would be having an ecological release. Our bodies are that island to the virus, which is the rats. And the virus is going to spread and spread and spread like any Darwinian organism to optimize its fitness and survive. And, we are irrelevant to the virus. We know now quite a bit about this pathogen, but interestingly, Chinese scientists were releasing information very early on in January on public listservs. And by February of 2020, Italian scientists were doing the same, which made it possible for us to know some basic attributes of the virus. For example, how infectious is the virus? And its basic reproduction number, its R sub 0, is about 3 for the original Wuhan strain of the virus. And we also knew how deadly was the virus. We knew very quickly that the infection fatality rate was between 0.5 and 1.2%, approximately 1% or 0.8%. It matters a lot how old you are, but we knew how deadly was the virus, and that's a pretty deadly virus. It's quite a concerning level of lethality for a pathogen. And if you took just those two parameters, which were available to us in January of 2020, and you plotted them on a graph, so you had how deadly is the virus on the x-axis, and how infectious is it, it's R naught on the y-axis, and you looked at all the respiratory pandemics for the last 100 years, Up here in the upper right would be the 1918 Spanish flu influenza pandemic, and which was the deadliest respiratory pandemic we've had in the last 100 years. Down here in the lower left would be the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, which we all lived through, but most people don't really remember because it wasn't very deadly. In here in the middle, we'd have the 1957 pandemic, which was the second worst respiratory pandemic we've had in the last 100 years. And just using those two parameters, you would have seen that this would have been and has proven to be the second worst respiratory pandemic we've had in the last 100 years. So we get respiratory pandemics every 10 or 20 years. We get serious ones every 50 or 100 years. It was possible to know that this was going to be a serious one, as it's proven to be right from the beginning. Now, I have a number of Chinese collaborators who are based in Hong Kong, and I began tracking this virus in January of 2020 using phone data. We had data on 11 million people moving through the city of Wuhan in January of 2020, and we started using that data to forecast the course of the epidemic and published that paper in the journal Nature in April of 2020. My point is that many groups around the world, including many Korean groups who have a tremendous experience with respiratory pandemics for a number of reasons, could see what was happening and could respond appropriately to this threat. In the United States right now, we have over 750,000 Americans who have died. In Korea, it's about 6,800, I understand. But we have 20 times the death rate in the United States in Korea. So in the United States, we have 2,600 deaths per million people. And in Korea, you have, I understand, 131 deaths per million people. So we have 20 times the death rate in my country, I'm ashamed to say. And perhaps 1 million will die from current variants of the virus. And of course, worldwide, we have had many million, 5 million or more deaths. And very importantly, from a public health point of view, something that doesn't get as much attention as it should, is that probably 5 times as many people as die of this virus will be disabled by it. So I'm not talking about long or short COVID. I'm saying you've recovered from the disease, but your body is scarred. So you have some pulmonary fibrosis, or renal or pancreatic insufficiency, or cardiac or neurologic or psychiatric problems. That means in the United States, we'll have 5 million people with these problems, and analogous numbers in countries around the world. In my view, we are not at the beginning of the end of this pandemic, but we are approaching the end of the beginning. The opening phase of the pandemic is almost behind us in many, perhaps even most parts of the world. Now, the way we've come to live during this pandemic may feel very alien and unnatural, but it's actually neither of those things. Plagues are a part of the human condition. They appear in every literary tradition around the world. In the West, they are in the Bible. They're in Homer's Iliad, the oldest written work of Western fiction. The Iliad, written by the Greeks, starts with a plague. That's the beginning of the book, is a plague. They're in Shakespeare. They're in Cervantes. So the important thing to understand is that what happened to us in 2020 was not new to our species. It was just new to us. We think this is crazy that we have to put up with this situation, but actually our ancestors tried to warn us. They reduced this experience into our religious traditions and into our literary traditions. They tried to say to their descendants, us, be aware, there's this thing called plague. It afflicts human beings. It comes from time to time. It's awful. And you need to understand how to deal with it. But we forget and we are shocked. And the irony is that in the modern era, in the 21st century, not only do we have religious and literary traditions, but we also have scientific traditions. In veterinary medicine, looking at zoonotic diseases. In public health, looking at pandemics. In virology, in medical history, in epidemiology. In other words, we have experts in so many disciplines that knew what was happening to us, that had studied this. I mean, people often ask me, how could it be that I was so right about what was going to happen about the pandemic? And my answer is, I paid attention in school. I mean, when I was educated, we were taught about respiratory pandemics. It's not as if nobody knew what was going to happen. So we have a scientific tradition as well as a religious and literary tradition that can inform us. And I think that people think, and so the epidemic has affected us in a number of ways. Many of them are typical because we don't just have knowledge about respiratory pandemics. Actually, we have very good information about respiratory pandemics going about 300 years, and we have excellent information about respiratory pandemics going back 100 years. But we have information about plagues in general going back thousands of years. And many people think, and you can use that knowledge to understand the social impact of plagues in general. Many people think that what we are doing in response to the pandemic is collapsing our economy, that it's the human actions that are causing the problem. But actually, it's the virus itself that's causing the problem. An estimate by former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and a colleague of his, David Cutler, estimated that the economic damage in the United States is $16 trillion. $8 trillion due to economic disaster, and $8 trillion due to health problems, death, disability, illness, absenteeism, and so on. So this is the biggest economic catastrophe to afflict the United States in the last 100 years, surpassing even the Great Depression, according to some estimates. But the important thing to understand is that this behavior that we have adopted, this physical distancing, this economic collapse, this slowing down, are all intrinsic features of plagues. For example, during the plague of Justinian, which was a bubonic plague 1,500 years ago, a man by the name of John of Ephesus, who was a priest and a historian, said the following. He said, "And in all ways, everything was brought to naught, was destroyed and turned into sorrow, and buying and selling ceased, and the shops with all their worldly riches beyond description closed. The entire city then came to a standstill, as if it had perished. Thus, everything ceased and stopped." And this account of what happens during a plague is eerily familiar, isn't it? But understand this, 1,500 years ago, there wasn't a government that ordered schools to close. There wasn't a government that ordered shops to close. Those things happened anyway because of people's responses. It's the virus that causes the economic collapse, not government action that does it. If anything, government action reduces the impact of the plague on the economy. Now, of course, plagues have other kinds of implications. They can inflame dark tendencies in human beings. Fear and lies and denial are constant companions to plagues, again seen for thousands of years. In fact, denial is such a constant feature when you look at accounts going back thousands of years that we might even think of denial as an essential aspect of an epidemic. In other words, in addition to the classic public health definition that an R naught greater than 1 means it's an epidemic, right? That each case makes more than one case. That means that the number of cases is rising. That's what it means to be an epidemic. We might want to add some social parameters and say, well, actually, when you have denial, that means that it's a plague. That's how common denial is. And you can see it going very far back. my laboratory has studied social networks using mathematical models, and we have modeled the spread of germs through the hyperdimensional surface that is a social network. So a network is a complex topology. It's a mathematical object, and you can understand how the germ spreads from person to person to person in this complicated structure. And you can study how lies spread in the structure, because right behind the germ follow lies. And you can actually model these spreading processes using differential equations, using families of differential equations as a kind of dueling contagion. So the lies are spreading and the germ is spreading, and the question is which one will outstrip the other. And so you can bring modern tools to bear to study these ancient processes. Superstition and lies have always been part of plagues. In fact, we saw this in the United States when even the president of the United States was saying things like denial, nothing is happening, nothing is happening. For over a year, the former president said, nothing is happening. We saw the emergence of quacks, people selling, inject yourself with bleach or take silver, or all this interest in hydroxychloroquine at the beginning, which there was no evidence for the utility of this drug, clinically speaking. And you saw denials, you saw misinformation. And the same plague of Justinian, 1,500 years ago, the same observer said, he made a very funny observation. He said, rumors appeared in the city, and women in one part of the city said, if you go to the second floor of your house and throw out ceramic pots from the second-story window so that they crash on the street below, that will keep the plague away. And so John of Ephesus said, it therefore became more dangerous to walk through the city for fear of being hit by pots than from contracting the germ, okay? So even he was observing the rise of misinformation 1,500 years ago. Plagues are also a time of blame. It is a typical human response to try to blame other humans. We saw this in the 14th century when the Jews were blamed for the Black Death. We saw this with HIV, where homosexuals were blamed, or people from Haiti were blamed, or IV drug users were blamed. We saw this with COVID-19, when Asians were blamed, or immigrants were blamed. Always there's a desire to blame someone else. This is very typical of plagues. And finally, plagues are also a time of loss. They are a time of grief. People lose their lives, they lose their livelihoods, and they lose their way of life. And this makes people very sad. Now, there are three phases to this epidemic, this kind of respiratory pandemic. The immediate phase, which we're approaching the end of, it's going to end in 2022. The intermediate phase, which will last a couple of years until 2024, and then the post-pandemic phase. The immediate phase is when we are feeling the biological and epidemiological shock of the virus, as the virus, like a wave, sweeps through the human population, like a tsunami washing ashore, and it causes great destruction as the water moves inland. But then eventually the water recedes, the wave goes away. And the immediate impact of the pandemic, the immediate phase is over. This will be when we reach endemicity. The virus won't be eradicated, but what will happen is we'll reach the point where most people are immune, either because they've been vaccinated or because they have survived an infection. And then the number of deaths per day will fall back down to something like an ordinary flu, and it'll now enter the background causes of death in our society. And we're going to reach this herd immunity threshold in the United States very soon. And that will mark the end of the immediate phase. But then, just like the tsunami, the waters recede, there's an enormous destruction, and we're going to have to clean up the mess. And that's going to be the case in the United States and in Korea. We're going to have to deal with the aftermath, the psychological, clinical, economic, and social aftershocks of the virus. And that will typically last for a couple of years until the society can kind of get back on its feet. And then in approximately 2024, and these are approximate, we will finally put the epidemic behind us. I think then it will be a little bit like the roaring 20s of the 21st century, like the roaring 20s of the 20th century. I think we're going to see people will be very happy that the plague is over, like the survivors after an earthquake who come out into the streets and are relieved, or after any disaster, like after a war, there is rejoicing when the war is over. When the plague is finally over, I think people will be relieved. We'll see a lot of social interactions. We'll see economic boom. We'll see an artistic kind of efflorescence. An entrepreneurship will be very visible. So I think we're going to have quite an exciting period when the plague is finally behind us. These are approximate, and they're not bright lines. They'll feather into each other, but these are the way you can think about the phases of an epidemic: immediate, intermediate, and the post-pandemic phase. Given the mutations in this virus, and the Delta variant had an R0 of 6, and the Omicron variant is probably as contagious, pretty much everyone on the planet is either going to be vaccinated with this condition or will be infected, or both. And those are your choices in this situation. Now, new variants might throw a spanner in the works. The thing that concerns me the most is the possibility that we might have new mutations that either fully evade the vaccine, which we have not seen to date. We've seen a drop in vaccine efficacy with the new variants, but not full evasion, or that are much deadlier. And there are coronaviruses which are much deadlier. For example, MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, has an IFR of about 30%. It's 30 times deadlier than than SARS-CoV-2. Just imagine what would happen in our society if new variants emerged that were that deadly. I put the probability at the emergence of one of those things, new variants that are much deadlier or fully evade the vaccines, at between 1 and 10%. So I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. And if that happens, everything I've just told you goes out the window, and we go back to square one, where we have to hunker down again, wait for new vaccines to be developed, and cope with a further disaster in our society. So COVID-19 is going to have both a biological and a social end. Biologically, as I said, it's going to become endemic and circulate among us. In addition, it's likely, in keeping with evolutionary theory, that the virus will mutate to become more benign. And if you look at the history of respiratory pandemics, including the so-called Russian flu of 1890, which many people think was influenza, but other people think, and I think that's possible, was actually a coronavirus pandemic, and that one of the modern coronaviruses that causes the cold, the common cold, OC43, actually was a deadly respiratory pandemic of 1890. And now we're just seeing, after 100 years, circulating mutant variants which are benign. For a number of Darwinian reasons I don't have time to go into, it is theorized these pathogens mutate to become more benign. And I think that that's what's one of the other likely biological ends of coronavirus, that it'll just, over the next decade, we'll see more benign versions that circulate. People will encounter this pathogen when they're young. Because the virus spares the young, they won't die, but they'll generate some immunity. And then if they re-encounter the pathogen in the future as adults, they won't die either, because now they have some immunity. So what's going to happen is it's going to be a virus that we just encounter when we're young. It causes a common cold, and it's just a pest that we have to deal with in the future. And there are other viruses that are like this. For example, chickenpox or Epstein-Barr virus are viruses that if you encounter when you're young, don't cause you serious illness. But if you've never encountered them when you're young and you get them for the first time as an adult, causes serious illness. And so I think coronavirus might be like that. But pandemics are also a social phenomena. and they have a social end too, not just a biological end. And in this regard, plagues end when everyone believes they have ended, and when everyone is simply willing to tolerate more risk. What you have to understand about this is that our world has changed. There's a new pathogen out there. It's like radiation has rained down from the heavens and contaminated our environment. It's just there. We're living in a different environment than we lived in before. And at some point, especially once enough people are vaccinated, I think people are going to say enough is enough, and we're going to sort of declare victory, maybe prematurely, against the pathogen. So now the vaccine initiatives, as you all know, have been amazing. We are the first generation of humans alive who have been able to cope with this ancient threat by developing effective countermeasures while the pandemic was afflicting us. This is very rare. And I think the vaccines have played a very big role, especially in societies like Korea, that were able to use non-pharmaceutical interventions early on to keep death low and now vaccinate their populations, which is, of course, the fantasy outcome, right? I mean, that's what everyone wants to do, is you control the population until you have a vaccine, then immunize everybody, and you emerge on the other side of the pandemic with very few deaths. Not many countries around the world were able to achieve this, unfortunately, but I believe Korea has done a pretty good job. I want to say a couple more things, and then I'll stop, I think, on schedule, which is that there's no God-given reason that this pandemic wasn't worse. And it could have been. In other words, imagine if we had everything the same, except SARS-CoV-2 killed 10% of the people or 20% of the people it infected. That could have been the case. That's an intrinsic property of the virus. And if that had happened, we would have had a completely different type of situation, a kind of Black Death situation in the 21st century in all our rich democracies, with all our wealth and our scientific knowledge. We would have been brought low. And this is why respiratory pandemics are rightly seen as national security threats. And there is evidence from veterinary medicine and public health and other fields that there is a rise in zoonotic diseases. Given climate change and population growth and many other reasons, we are increasingly coming into more and more contact with wild animals. And if you look decade by decade, there was a paper published in Nature about 10 years ago now, which looked at the number of zoonotic diseases per decade. And you all know that HIV is a zoonotic disease, Zika is a zoonotic disease, SARS-1 is a zoonotic disease, influenza are often zoonotic diseases. So there's various rickettsia and other conditions are zoonotic diseases. And so what we're finding is we're finding more and more zoonotic diseases with each decade, which is an alarm about what could be happening in the future. Furthermore, if you look at the interpandemic interval, and this is very difficult to estimate, there is a hint in the data that the time interval between serious pandemics, remember earlier I said it's between 50 and 100 years, could be shortening. Maybe it's now going to be every 20 to 40 years that we get a serious pandemic. But it's stochastic. It could happen at any time. We could have another serious respiratory pandemic in 2 years or 5 years or 10 or 50 years. We don't know. But there is reason for concern and alarm. Now, of course, these mRNA vaccine technologies give us a new way to cope with these threats, but we need to realize that it is likely that this is not the last pandemic or even serious pandemic that we are going to see in our own lifetimes. Anyway, plagues offer new challenges and new opportunities. There's a very famous French novel that I don't know how commonly read it is in Korea by a French philosopher by the name of Albert Camus, and it's called The Plague, or La Peste in French. And it is a fictional account of a plague afflicting a village in North Africa called Oran in the 1940s, but it's based on older epidemics. And the protagonist in the plague is a doctor by the name of Dr. Rieu. And I'd like to close with a small quote from this book, and it goes as follows. Dr. Rieu resolved to compile this chronicle so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure, and to state quite simply what we learn in time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men and women than to despise. And that's very much how I feel. There's more to admire in us as human beings and as people than there is to despise. And that's how I even choose to see the plague that has afflicted us in 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your great insightful lecture on your observation on the current pandemic. I guess we have a time to ask questions to Dr. Christakis. If you have any question, please raise your hand. Actually, I was hoping that nobody raised hand because I do have a question.
In my experience speaking in China and Korea, I've been to Korea twice. Actually, I've been to your university, I'm pretty sure, about 12 or 13 years ago. And Japan, they never ask, the students rarely ask questions. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, I mean, that is a tradition of Asian culture. So we are modest. We are not trying to interrupt other people's opportunity. And those people who are very not modest like me take the chance. But anyway, I mean, yeah, having read your book, I could understand what you try to deliver more clearly. And my question is like this. I mean, based on the observation of the history, like Justinian plague or like Athens plague, we kept learning lessons from the previous experience. And as you mentioned, just before closing your talk, the frequency of having pandemic is shortened and getting severe. And I think that is because of the two major important characteristics of the modern society, like urbanization or population density, and also transportation. So there is no comparison between the current 21st century and like 1500 years ago. So I think even though the virus is the one who will affect our society, but the amplitude or like extent of the impact will be getting greater and greater. And eventually they will end up with like doom. So, I mean, my question is there must be two ways to address these kinds of challenges. The first one, technological advances like messenger RNA vaccines, something like that. But maybe another, the better way is to kind of like reflect the way we behave that would promote the pandemic. So like, for example, you mentioned climate change or like wild habitat loss. I mean, there are many things we have to reflect and change, but the history, teach us that that may not be very unlikely because we kept having this kind of impact over and over, although all those lessons teach us otherwise. So how do you think about the prospect that we could change the way we behave on a global scale to better address this kinds of challenge? Or is there any only way for us to resolve this issue by technological advances? That's my question.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I think urbanization, you're right, plays a role. And there's actually some very interesting epidemiology. For example, in the pathogen of measles that afflicts humans, we now are pretty sure that measles descendant from another pathogen that afflicts cows called rinderpest, and it probably leapt to humans in Rome about 2,500 years ago when two criteria were met. First, we lived in close proximity to our domesticated animals. Many of the other diseases we have actually were zoonoses that came from domesticated animals in the past, like measles. And we had enough population size that when it leapt to humans, the pathogen had enough runway. In other words, if the population is too small, then even if a leap occurs, the virus burns itself out. So Rome at the time had 1 million 1 million inhabitants in Rome 2,500 years ago, approximately. And so this leap occurred. So urbanization has definitely played a role. But I don't think we're going to reverse that, because ever since we invented cities 8,000 years ago, people love cities. They're exciting places. And the world has gotten more and more urbanized, even in the last 50 years. So I don't think that's going to change. But I think things like climate change that you alluded to, we could affect. And also, frankly, some of our dietary habits. For example, in China, nobody talks about this anymore. The Chinese cuisine, of course, is one of the world's great cuisines. Like French cuisine is considered one of the others, and Indian. So Chinese cuisine is phenomenal. I love Chinese food. But they eat, as you know, everything in China. And the Ministry of Agriculture, in February or March, I think in March of 2020, the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture said that the country needed to revisit its practices of eating wild animals. That, they said we need to eat more modern, domesticated animals now. So there may be some benefits that can come from that, like revisiting the wild animal trade, for example, and the consumption of wild animals. That would be a very hard cultural transition in China. I don't know. I mean, I've eaten Korean food, of course, but I don't know how widespread this is in Korea, the eating of, non-domesticated animals. So there are things like that, as you're saying, Professor Choi, that we could change. I don't think we're going to be able to change urbanization, but how we contribute to habitat loss, how we contribute to climate change, what animals we consume and how we consume them, how we educate our populace, right? How we educate people to cope and basically behave well when there is a respiratory pandemic. These are things I think that we can change and we will have to change. Did I answer your question, or I think I may have forgotten part of it?
You answered enough, and thank you very much for sharing your insight.
The technological, humans always want a technological fix. And one of the things that makes me laugh about Americans is that we were awful with the social response, but we were pretty good with the technical response, which is a typical American, because it's sort of lazy, right? It's like, well, we're going to spend money and we're going to invent technologies and they'll fix the problem. And I don't know if there's always a technical fix to social problems. I think a lot of social problems require social responses. They don't have technological responses.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think that's great answer based on your combination of expertise in sociology, medicine, public health, and also I know you're very expert in history as well. So with that, I think we have to wrap up the first plenary lecture. And,
Professor Choi, there is a question on the chatting box.
Okay, thank you. We do not have enough time, but if you can answer the question.
I see on super spreaders. On super spreaders, it has to do with their location in a network. We just had a paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society that just appeared last year on super spreaders that you can look at. And in my book, Connected, which came out in 2009, which has also been translated into Korean, we talk about super spreading and infection. So those are a couple of sources you can look at that.
Okay, so thank you very much for your answer. Maybe we can refer to his book, Connected.